Alright, so in today's video, I want to break down the games of a Swedish Grandmaster, Ulf Andersson, who reached world number 4 using a very simple system with white, which I want to share with you guys in this video. And the thing about the system, right, first of all, it was not the London system. We don't talk about that on this channel, FYI if you're new here. And rather what Ulf instead played was the more refined Catalan opening, which is characterized by the establishment of your pawns on d4 and c4, sort of like you would in a Queen's Gambit, where instead of maybe trying to establish both of your knights in the center, go bishop g5 like you would in the very classical Queen's Gambit declined, you instead fianchetto your bishop on the long diagonal to create long-lasting positional pressure. And this can not only be used against more of like a classical opening such as the Queen's Gambit declined we see on the board right now, but also more hypermodern ones such as the King's Indian. But with that all being said, in today's video I want to break down 5 of Ulf's best games in the Catalan opening, where you will not only be learning some of the theory, but hopefully more importantly understanding middle game positions, so that even if your opponent plays something a little bit different, you can then outplay your opponents when you get to these sorts of positions. So getting into game number 1 here, we have Andersson against San Segundo Carrillo. I'm probably saying that wrong, but it opened up with 1d4, and we see the following moves when we arrive at the Catalan after g3. I should briefly note, however, that Ulf usually preferred to enter the Catalan with a 1 knight f3 move order, and then say against knight f6 going c4, e6 g3, and then only now going for d4. However, in the context of this game, Ulf decided to go for this slightly more common move order, and after he plays g3 we see bishop to b4 checks. And bishop b4 check is probably one of the most popular moves against the Catalan defense at even the very highest levels, and the reason is after bishop d2 you go back to e7 and you basically say this bishop is actually misplaced on the d2 square. I should also note that very commonly when this is played at lower levels, a lot of people play like bishop takes d2 check, but the problem is after just knight b takes d2, well, there's two issues. One is that our knight has been developed to a kind of useful square, and the second issue is that you've traded off your dark squared bishop as black, which is your like good bishop, right? So there's kind of two issues with that. So often at lower levels when you see bishop b4 check, it's usually not because people are going to play bishop e7, it's often because people just want to take and trade pieces. But okay, getting back to the game again with bishop to e7 instead of taking, we see the following moves. So bishop g2, castles, castle, c6. And this is a very common type of position in general for the closed Catalan. Black has this sort of semi-Slav pawn structure, and white really needs to figure out kind of a way to progress in this position. And I would say the main kind of drawback of black's position is the fact that their light squared bishop is locked in. So you don't want to, for example, just take and then like allow them to open it up, right? That would be a big strategic mistake. But what you do want to do is try and eventually go for this e4 break in the center, which if you're able to achieve and get black to say take, and you can somehow recapture with a knight, you're very often going to have this nice base advantage in the center with the pawns on d4 and c4 versus these ones, and again a struggling light squared bishop on the c8 square. So usually to achieve this, queen c2 is played, and in the game b6 happened, and obviously with the queen it's not enough to really get an e4 break just yet, so you're going to want the support of a knight. However, if in this position you play knight to c3, you kind of have to watch out for d takes c4, just simply winning a pawn since our queen is no longer protecting this square. And now in this exact position I think we might have something like knight to e5, and potentially we can get some counterplay on the c4 pawn, and also the c6 one. If they take, maybe we have even bishop to f4, rook d1, and there's a lot of things black has to kind of watch out for. So in this position white could get away with knight to c3, but let's say black plays an alternative move order such as knight b to d7. In this case, after knight c3, d takes c4 in particular, we see that this doesn't really work for white, because now the knight's protecting the square, you can't easily play knight to e5, or if you do this just doesn't really work, and black is just simply up a pawn. And it's definitely possible to play this as a gambit, but most Catalan players prefer more of a risk-free position. Ulf was definitely of that sort of character, and so after knight b7 he probably would have played a similar move to what he did in the game, with probably like bishop f4 for example. So okay, after b6 we also saw bishop to f4, And the idea is basically that he wanted to free up the d2 square for the knight, right, so he could get in this e4 break, which by the way, to just serve as a comparison, right, how like it's quicker to get an e4 if the bishop is on c1, not on d2. Let's say black plays bishop e7 immediately, and after c6, queen c2, knight bd7, we see the same set of moves. Well, because we haven't had to like move our bishop twice to vacate d2 for the knight, we can just go for this very quickly now, and I think white has kind of a nice edge in this position, especially if black takes, and again we get this sort of nice space advantage we were talking about earlier. But okay, bishop to f4, bishop b7, knight bd2, and very logical, again trying to go for the e4 break as we've been discussing. This is the plan you want to go for, and in the game black basically just allowed it. They played knight bd7, e4, and white had a pretty nice position already on move 11. However, they probably could have in this scenario gone, let's say, knight to h5, and basically what this does is attacks our bishop, threatens to win the bishop here, and also give us doubled f-pawns. This isn't the end of the world. Some people are okay with allowing this, but a very typical response would be something like, let's say, bishop to e3, just simply avoiding that trade. And sometimes black is just going to come back for the knight, honestly, and basically say that, like, okay, on e3 your bishop is just misplaced, and the reason is it stops you from getting in the e4 break, which is basically what your whole position revolves around. So it's not uncommon to see grandmaster games from here go like bishop f4, knight h5, and just see them repeat moves, shake hands, go home, and get in the couch and have a beer. However, if you want more out of life, which maybe Ulf did in this game, I'm not too sure, maybe he would have taken on d5, for example, takes, and before black gets in knight c6 and rook c8, in which case they'd be very comfortable, maybe trying to play knight to e5, rook c1, and get control of the c file. Also, it's worth noting we're only making this exchange once black is already committed to this b6 move. They've weakened the c6 square a little bit. They're not going to be able to take and then get their bishop out on this diagonal, which is why in this position it does make some sense to play this move. C takes d5. But okay, returning back to the game, we saw knight b7, and maybe I am being a bit harsh here because after e4, it's not like that bad for black. Let's say if they go, say, d takes e4, and then after takes they get knight f6 and c5 very quickly, opening the bishop up on this diagonal. But still very often in these positions, even if they do achieve this, still white has a little bit more active pieces, and it's a very sort of risk-free position. And also it's important to get in c5 very quickly because, like, let's say you play a random preparatory move like rook to c8, well then this might be a good moment to pause the video and think about what you would play as white. But if you've seen some of my other videos on the Catalan, you should know by now this is a prime moment to go c5, stopping black from doing this, shutting in the bishop, and even though you give up the d5 square for the knight, it doesn't really matter in comparison to the fact that you might just be basically playing down a piece for like the remainder of the game with the bishop shut in here. And that might sound a bit dramatic, but truth be told, that is very often kind of what ends up happening. So after e4, rook to c8 was played in the game, keeping the tension, sort of asking white what they're going to do. Ulf plays rook 81. I think the computer really wants to go e5 and gain space because computers love space, but Ulf keeps the tension. And now this is a situation in which taking no longer might be as feasible, because after takes, for example, knight f6, queen to c2, with the rook already on the d file, c5, d takes c5 gains a tempo on the queen, and if you can't get in c5 immediately, yes, who is going to play it? Us. So Ulf's opponent tried to do something a little bit dramatic here, which, to be honest, yeah, it was a bit of a questionable decision, b5. And sometimes this is an idea that can occur in the course Catalan, but in this scenario after c5 from Mr. Ulf here, black's position is just very passive, and as we've talked about already, if you take and then like try to get a knight onto d5, it just really doesn't matter, to be honest, because again your bishop is shut in, and that is a bit of a problem. So c5, very important move. You don't really want to keep the tension with something like b3, because then black is probably going to take, go c5, trade off all the pawns, and they're going to probably be equal, and we don't want that. So c5, very important move. Instead of that, again, like c5 probably here as well was a decent idea, just trying to like exchange off a bunch of stuff in the center. I'm not 100% how white is supposed to deal with this. Maybe you say take though, for example, play rook fe1, and already black has to be slightly careful how they do things. For example, if they play c takes d4, this might be okay, but after knight takes d4, it's a little bit unpleasant because the pawn is pinned, because otherwise the bishop would hang, of course, and stuff like knight f5 could be coming, and our pieces are just getting very active. So again, b5 though, c5, and really from here black just struggled the rest of the game. They couldn't come up with a productive plan. They tried to play knight h5, f5, getting very desperate, but after takes, you might want to take a bit of a small think here and try and figure out what you would do with white. But essentially f4 is kind of a threat, and we can't exactly stop it, but we can limit the damage, and Ulf did this by playing knight to b3 with the idea that, like, you know, if we just sit around and do nothing, then we're going to have to basically ruin our pawn structure when f4 comes, because we're going to have to play g takes, and this is going to inherently weaken our king side. But with knight b3 if f4 comes, then we can keep this as one sort of compact pawn island. We don't have to take allowing their knight here. If they ever take, then we keep control of that square, and positionally we're doing very well. So after knight to b3, he played rook to a8, Ulf's opponent, trying to protect his pawn in some lines. That's important. Bishop to d2, king h8. Again, he doesn't really know what to do, so he just like shuffles his king. Rook fe1, and here we see rook f7. This is important because if you, let's say, just go like random move like g6, well, actually knight takes a5 is a threat, and if you take back, take, and take, it might seem like you're winning two minor pieces for the rook, but at the end of the line, your bishop will hang. So as prophylaxis, he plays rook to f7. And again, you might want to take a bit of a small thing here, try to figure out like, okay, my pieces, they look pretty good. Black's position has a lot of weaknesses in it, especially after playing this f5 move. The e5 square in particular definitely stands out as the probably biggest weakness they've created. So try and think a little bit about how we can maybe use some of these things to our advantage and how we can further improve some of our pieces. But that being said, the way Ulf continued from here was by playing knight to c1, and his idea was, of course, just to utilize the weak square. So he's bringing the knight to d3 and probably to e5 in the future. You see g6, knight to d3, and the very subtle move queen to c1. And the idea is now, after knight to g7, again, we want to kind of use the weak e5 square, and we could maybe bring our bishop to f4 and try to do something like that, but bishop to g5 is also a very decent way of trying to do so by basically just forcing an exchange of the dark squared bishop. There's no way they can avoid this. Queen to c7, we take, and instead of bringing the knight to, let's say, e5, where it would be doing like a decent job, Ulf was like, no, I'm going to bring the knight to f4. And to be honest, I think knight e5 was also probably okay, but the knight here could also be poking around the e6 square and also potentially helping support an eventual kingside advance. So we see rook to e5. Again, it is slightly more natural to maybe put the knight there, but you know, Ulf's a very strong player. I'm not going to question him too much. Knight to e4. Rook e1, we see b4, so black is maybe trying to get some counterplay on the queen side, maybe even open up their bishop. We can just kind of ignore it though, it doesn't really do much. They take, again, like, I mean, they get the open b file, but maybe that's not even, maybe that's something like we can use, right? Maybe that's not even to their benefit. So bishop to c8, yeah, like really just trying to probably defend some stuff around the, I'm not sure what to call this, like this isn't exactly like e6 square, that's not really king side or queen side. Okay, you get what I mean though. They're trying to cover up some weaknesses, and we see knight to g5 at this point, where we're sort of putting some pressure on the knight, also the rook, and black has really just been struggling this whole game, and they crack and play knight takes g5. This was also a rapid game, I believe, which accounts for maybe some of the mistakes that black has made in this game, but ultimately it was a much better decision to just keep the knight there and retreat the rook from the attack of the knight, and basically say to white, like, okay, if you want to remove the knight, you're either going to have to take it, which is not very good, because then, like, you open a bunch of black's pieces up, or you're going to have to play f3, and then, only then, I'm going to take. And there are some differences with taking on g5 immediately. For example, let's say in this position, right, if you just like shuffle your bishop back, one problem you're going to face in several lines is like white sacrificing on d5 and then following up with bishop takes d5. But when you play f3, right, and let's say you get like a similar kind of position, well, you can't really ever take on d5 because your bishop is covered up, and white still definitely has an advantage, but it's not like we're just going to be brutally murdering black like we sort of were in the game. So see, following kind of sequence of moves, knight to e6, and we crash in. Equal material, but if you compare the quality of both sides' pieces, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that, like, yeah, black is basically in big trouble. They play f4 trying to get some desperate counterplay in. Also worth noting that we don't just have the e file, we also can use the b file that, again, black opened up earlier, and was it really to their benefit? Not really sure, right? So f4 happens, they try to get this counterplay in, but it doesn't really go anywhere, because if they take, we can probably just go rook to e7, rook f7, and I don't exactly see a clear win just yet, but we can probably just continue improving our pieces. Take rook e7 next, and it's not looking good. So the game finished off with rook d8, rook f6. Again, if they make some sort of exchange, I assume this is not going to be a very pretty end. So rook f6 happens, bishop c8, and that just hangs another pawn. And this is where stuff really just comes collapsing down as d5 hangs, and even though they are going to win the queen, it doesn't really matter because we're going to be winning the material back with interest on top of that. So game number 2 here, we have an open Catalan this time. We start off as well with the one knight f3 move order and enter the Catalan in this fashion, and here we see d takes c4. Instead of this more kind of closed Catalan approach where black puts a pawn on c6 and establishes this kind of more sturdy pawn center, they immediately grab the pawn and basically say, I don't believe in your whole opening concept. Let me just take that real quick. And the main line here is to go bishop to g2, and I guess the problem with bishop to g2, which is again the main move in this position, is that it gives black many different kind of options to choose from. Some of them more positional, some of them more sharp. You get a lot of different positions, but Ulf, he was a minimalist at heart, and he just wanted to get a simple game where he could kind of just outplay the opponent based on his understanding of the positions he was going to get. And the way he did that against the open Catalan was by going queen to a4 check, guaranteeing that he is going to immediately win the pawn back, not really wanting many of these more complicated lines, let's say, where maybe black can even go b5 immediately, trying to hold on to the pawn. So okay, he went queen to a4, and there's a variety of different moves black has. Bishop to d7, knight d7, and c6 are the main ones. In this game, knight b7 happened with the idea of playing a6, b5, and white could take this immediately, but in this game decides to play knight c3 first with the idea of b5. We can play knight takes b5, and you can't really take back. So first of all, rook b8 is played, trying to prepare this, and now Ulf takes on c4. We have b5, bishop b7, and we see black completing their development in this fashion. We've seen that sometimes, especially in the last game, right, this knight squared bishop can be a problem, but if you can easily develop it out, and let's say achieve the c5 break as well, challenging the d4 stronghold, then you're probably going to have a pretty decent game. And Ulf has had some games before where he would just castle, and then after c5, go take, bishop f4, and he would have these sort of positions, and he even has won some games, but he has also drawn many games as well from these sorts of positions. Because the position is very kind of symmetrical, as you can see, there's not that many imbalances, but as we are going to see in this game, Ulf was very skilled at handling these sorts of positions where seemingly there wasn't really much to play for. However, in this game, he played a bit of a different move order. He played bishop to f4 first, kind of limiting black's ability to go c5 very quickly. We saw bishop to d6 challenging it, and if you just take this, well, I think the black's pretty okay. They control the center fairly well. If you ever try to go e4, black can play b4, and then e4 is going to hang, because of course once you move your knight away, there's just not enough defenders on the center. So this kind of position, very dry, difficult to really make anything of. So Ulf decided to actually castle and allow black to double his f pawns, and then after c5 basically was forced to take the pawn, because like if you allow, let's say you play rook fd1, right, maybe not the end of the world, but you do allow c4 and black starts like advancing their pawn mass, and maybe even I think the computer says already that black is slightly better. So that's why in these sorts of positions typically you want to take on the c5 square, knight takes c5, and pretty much again you want to exchange queens. Otherwise you just sort of like lose a tempo if you retreat somewhere. So this makes sense. Takes, and Ulf plays rook to f to c1. And just taking a brief pause at this position, many of you probably looking at this and are like, why are you showing us this now? Like, this looks super dry. Looks like no one's ever gonna win this. Like, this is boring. I'm just gonna like quick off the video. But this is kind of just where the magic is beginning. A lot of people indeed will believe those things, and they aren't necessarily all wrong. But in the hands of Ulf Andersson, these positions very often were anything but a simple draw. They were the sorts of positions that when his opponents knew who they were playing against and they got into these sorts of positions, they often knew there was a very long road ahead of them, or if they didn't yet know that, they were soon about to find that out. And just a quick quote that I want to read. For most of us, if we're playing a peer and major exchanges occur, a quick draw is the likely result. For Andersson, exchanges are often not the prelude to a quick draw, but the signal that it is time for his opponent to start suffering. Yeah, if that doesn't give you the chills, I don't know what will. So anyways, knight c to e4 was played in the game, and this looks like a very natural sort of move, just trying to exchange off like the knight which was being eyed by the rook and just like, you know, make a draw, right? But again, against Andersson, that's not exactly how things work. And objectively as well, this was not a particularly great move, at least relatively to what black could have done. So first of all, rook f to c1. It's slightly interesting what he's doing for the rook. It looks maybe slightly more natural to bring this rook to c1. And to be honest, it's difficult to really explain exactly why this rook is preferable to this one. It's likely a very small reason that comes down to something like in some line, maybe you want this pawn on a2 to be protected, or maybe you're going to go for the a4 break. This one I'm less sure about because there's often just b4 in response to that, but regardless of which rook you do bring to c1, there's a common thread among them, which is that, like, let's say you just castle, right? Knight takes b5 is actually a threat, and after rook takes e5, white has just won a pawn. So it would seem like black doesn't really want to go this castles, right? You would really want to make a conscious effort to really counter this knight takes b5 threat. However, as it was, after castles, knight takes b5 actually ran into knight d3, and after takes, white is indeed up a pawn, but because our structure is basically ruined here, that extra pawn doesn't really matter so much. Black is likely just going to be able to win it back. This is being attacked. Maybe knight d5 to knight takes f4 is also an idea, but probably simpler than doing that even is just bringing the rook to c8 and directly defending against it, to be honest. And then very likely something like knight to e5, similar to the game, takes, and just bring the king to e7, make it nice and centralized. If b4 ever happens, bring the knight back. And like, yeah, to be honest, this position, realistically, even for Andersson, a player with his level of endgame skill, is going to find this very difficult to win. It's very, very equal. However, in the game, knight c to e4 happened, and we simply took it, takes, and it seems like we're one exchange closer to making a draw. Another exchange probably closer to making a draw. And at first sight, it might seem like what white wants to do is play rook to c6, invade and attack the pawn, but you need to be a little bit careful here because probably black's going to go for rook d2, and while you're busy attacking this little fella, they're going to go and attack these guys and get counterplay. So Ulf was very good at detecting these sorts of possibilities of counterplay and preventing them. So he played rook to c2, just carefully monitoring this file and then slowly preparing and improving his pieces for battle. So rook to c2 was played, and basically stopping rook to d2, and likely what you would expect maybe from black is something like rook d6 consolidating the 6th rank, maybe rook c8 trying to challenge the rook, in which case we're of course is going to stack up our other rook on the c file, and this sort of ending, again, we're fine playing him because we just have a slightly more active rook. Our knight's also probably a bit more useful, and in general these pawns which were advanced earlier, we're starting to see now that kind of the problem and the real thing that gives white any sort of advantage is really just that these pawns are more easily exposed to different sorts of attacks than kind of like our ones on a2 and b2, right? Which I guess also stems from the fact that our rook is just more active to begin with, so these things sort of tie in with one another. But nonetheless, rook c2 happens, and instead of any of those moves I was mentioning earlier, such as rook c8, rook like d6, we actually saw rook to d2. And the problem with this was that after takes rook c1, the knight on d2 was sort of questionable in the role it was serving. It sort of got dragged into the deep end where it doesn't really have any real targets to attack. So we saw rook to a8, a bit of a passive move, but at this point it was already getting very difficult for really black to do anything in particular of substance. They can kick the knight away, but after knight to d3, it's still going to be very similar to the game. So we saw rook c1, rook c7, f6 is played, knight d3, and yeah, the real problem here is that like knight c5 is probably going to come next, like rook c6 or something, rook e7, attack one of these guys, and like yeah, it's just not very easy to defend against all these threats. Of course, the rook is more active than black's one. It also cuts the king off, which is what I want to say initially, and with knight e5 coming, as I mentioned earlier, again, these just all accumulate in white having a very easy position to play and a miserable defense for black. And because of that, black got a little bit desperate here, right? They played e5 with the idea that after takes knight takes e5, rook e8, maybe they're going to be able to get some counterplay on the e file, maybe even win a pawn back if they're lucky. So this happened, takes, rook e8, Probably wondering what happens after f4. Black's idea was g5. And the point is, if you take, of course, that hangs knight. And if you play e3, takes. Black's idea was to play rook f8 and basically force white to passively defend it. And maybe here, black has some drawing chances. The problem, however, is that after g5, white does not have to play e3. You might want to pause the video, try and think about what you think is the best move. But what Ulf ended up doing was bringing the knight back to g4, from where you basically ditch the whole e2 thing and say like, okay, this is a threat, so you probably want to deal with that. He did, but after knight f6 check, either you go to h8 and get mate in 1, probably said no thank you to that, so king to f8, knight takes h7 check, have to move the king, knight takes g5, and basically white is just up 2 queen pawns for no compensation. And the rest of the game, I don't think anything too interesting happened. He even won a third pawn, and as the, titled players like to say, the rest was a matter of technique, and for some reason, the recording ends with rook to e2 check, and I don't know if he resigned after playing that. That is a bit unconventional, but nonetheless a very nice illustration of how a very seemingly innocent endgame like this, not necessarily a simple draw for black to hold. So for our third game now, we're going to be talking about, so we've talked about the closed Catalan, the open Catalan, we've seen how Ulf sort of dealt with those, but now we're going to be talking about the delayed open Catalan, maybe perhaps the main line of the Catalan just in general, but we saw black do it in a slightly strange way. So usually how this is going to happen is bishop to e7, bishop g2, and you could again go for more of a closed Catalan type approach here, but d takes e4 is probably overall, especially at the master level, the most common move here, where yeah, you basically take on c4, but you do it after already having played bishop e7 and castles, hence the name, the delayed open Catalan, right? And generally the character of this sort of line is very solid. After queen c2, you play a6 and try to fianchetto the bishop on this diagonal, and after queen c2, bishop b7, there are a variety of different moves that white can play here. I noticed Ulf in his games very much like to go bishop to f4, but many years later bishop d2 was sort of established as the main line, very often with the idea to try and go to a5 and hit the c7 pawn, and very often actually just limiting black from getting the c5 break because the pawn is like pinned to the queen. However, quite a few years after like this bishop d2 idea became popular, another idea came along, which was to just play a4, kind of stopping b5, because after takes, right, this rook is going to hang, which incentivizes black to go bishop d7 if they want to get the bishop on this diagonal and try and neutralize our bishop, when after takes, bishop c6. This is probably the main line of this whole d takes c4 theme these days. And generally what I would say about this is, although it is very solid, it is also very difficult for black to actually play for a win. But okay, let's see how things actually happened in the game. So we see bishop to b4 check, bishop d2, the following moves, and c6 would transpose to the game we covered first spin of the video covering the closed Catalan, but in this game d takes c4 was played, and the problem with this is that after queen c2, queen takes c4, b5, queen c2, bishop b7, this transposes to this position we were looking at earlier, where it was white to move and bishop d2 was, we were just talking about, sort of the main line, but here we get to like this position, right? And it's actually with already bishop d2 inserted, white to move, which basically signals that this is a whole tempo down on a line where white is already kind of fighting for an advantage, which basically means by analogy that this is not good and black is definitely already struggling a bit in this position. However, that also made this game a very good illustration of some of the typical ideas that can happen in this pawn structure, as we will soon see. So rook d1, bringing the rook to the d file, can be useful in many situations to mitigate the effectiveness of the c5 break. Bishop e4, just kicking the queen back, very often a useful idea. Knight bd7, and here it might be tempting to, let's say, go knight to c3, but after just bishop to b7, it doesn't really serve a clear purpose, and probably black is just going to get in the quick c5 very soon and just kind of be equal. So the move that Ulf played in this position, again, is sort of what I mentioned earlier, was to go bishop to a5, a much more intentional move than just randomly developing a knight to c3, pinning down the pawn, attacking the c7 guy, which his opponent defends. And now utilizing the square that we've just opened up from our bishop moving, Ulf brought the knight to the d2 square instead of the c3 one, from where after bishop a8, queen c2 is just kind of further controlling this square, we could potentially bring the knight to the b3 square, where it would help further control this c5 one that, is very important in general in these positions, because this pawn is a backward pawn. If black ever achieves c5 successfully, like meaning they don't hang their queen in the process, they're probably gonna be at least equal. And that is exactly what black tried to achieve, right? And they played queen to b8 with the idea that, they're gonna play c5 next. It's not really very easy for white to do anything to stop it if they just casually develop a rook c5, and it's not really clear where this is going. So a very important moment for white, and I recommend here pausing the video trying to figure out what the correct idea is. But that being said, the correct idea is to play pawn to b4, where we just very forcefully shut down this whole c5 break. And if black tries to play like knight d5 or something to attack the b4 pawn, we just play a3, and it really is no problem. So with this in mind, it was actually better for black to not play queen to b8. The best move was actually to go knight to b8, or at least one of the better moves, with the idea that now if white plays b4 rather, knight c6 is a bit of an issue, because then the bishop is being attacked, and white is going to have to recapture for the a pawn here, and then c5 is going to have less of a grip on it. So if this did occur, probably white should instead play something like knight to b3, when black has a bit of a trouble coming up with their next move. For example, if they play knight c6, well, you do kick the bishop away, but if we just bring it backwards, it's blocking the c pawn from advancing, and it's kind of misplaced here. So after queen c2, queen b8 definitely wasn't the best, but yet again, if you have to play a move like knight to b8, your position's probably already in a little bit of trouble. So b4 happens, knight e5, a3, and it's very interesting what happens in the next 10-15 moves or so. So I'm just going to play through the moves very quickly, and you're going to see there's a lot of shuffling around, especially in this area of the game where he shuffled his queen back a lot. He shuffled his king from g1 to h2 back to g1, and then triangulated his king to h2. To be honest, I'm not really sure that had any real purpose to it, other than just sort of forcing his opponent to maybe burn some time and think about what he could potentially be doing. Ulf was very good at just sort of sitting there and doing nothing, and using his opponent's time to really scheme up what his real plan was. Of course, he wasn't just going to keep repeating until there was a threefold repetition. He had much greater ambitions, and one of these included bringing the knight to e1 and then to d3 and c5, and really improving his pieces. Also, I should note, if you go e5 here trying to fork these guys, then knight d5, and that hits a queen, and then black saves their piece, and actually you've just freed some of their pieces up, and now well, I think they're still not doing so great, but at the same time, at least they have some squares to use for their pieces now. So this is what we saw. Knight to e1 just continues improving them, and basically the big issue for black is the reason white was afforded the luxury of playing these seemingly nonsense moves like shuffling their pieces back and forth is just that black has no counterplay. They don't have an e5 break, they don't have a c5 break, their rook is locked in, their bishop is kind of shut in as well, their queen can't go anywhere, and it is again these sorts of positions that Ulf really just excelled in, and unfortunately also what caused his opponents a lot of misery, as we can see again from our opponent here. So knight to d3 shuffles the knight backwards. Knight to e5 decides it's actually best served on this square, maybe coming into c6. Black snaps that off before it can land there. Rook to b7. Does some funky maneuvering here to get the rook to b8, trying to kind of cover up the back rank, I guess. You go knight to b3, trying to get this into c5 perhaps. Takes. Rook to d8, just bring the bishop back, tuck it there. And f3, really shut in this bishop. Basically saying there's no way you're ever going to get any sort of counterplay there. Bishop to c8, and just some slow improvements. Brings the knight to d3, putting a little bit of pressure on this, I guess. Knight to b6, knight to c5, so he's really shuffling back and forth. And the thing is, right, is there's not really a clear breakthrough for white just yet. That's one annoying thing about black's position. It's very passive, but it is kind of solid at the same time. So eventually he decides, okay, I'm going to go for this h4, h5 thing. And after some thinking again, he decides another pawn break is going to go for g4, trying to get in some sort of g5 break. We see queen to a7, and he steps aside, going to g2. Not strictly necessary, he probably wants to just ensure he's not allowing any sort of queen trade maybe eventually. Let's say the knight came back to c8, f6, and in this very moment where black tried to maybe stop like g5 or something and try and put a bit of a break on the position, white pounced in with queen to c5, and after takes queen e7 just had to resign because there was no way black could really hold all these threats together. Their final defense was probably king to f7, but still this is a miserable position to play. At the very least we can like take here and maybe force them to take back with that. I don't think that's so great because if they take with the knight then they hang this. If they take with this, maybe we can get an e5. This one I'm actually not so sure about. There might be rook to d5, but maybe here, for example, knight to d4 is a decent idea, coming in with the knight to c6, and yeah, not really the type of position that you'd want to show your coach you got from your recent tournament. So yeah, again, the game concluded with f takes e5, queen to e7. Probably just missed that after being like so basically drained actually from like, if you think about all the back and forth maneuvering that White did in this game, like that can sort of hypnotize, and this might sound like bro science or something, but it can sort of hypnotize the opponent into the state where they don't really think about any more of like what their opponent's doing. They're just like, okay, they're doing this, I do that as well. And then eventually, because they're in that like sort of state, you could say, eventually their guard drops down and they stop really kind of looking for a lot of direct threats from the opponent, you could say, which is ultimately going to be a bit of a problem as it was in concluding this game. So it's worth noting, Ulf did not just have a lot of success playing against these sort of very classical e6, d5, queen's gambit declined approaches, but also had a lot of success playing against these more hyper-modern ones such as the King's Indian. So let's see how Ulf handled this in this game. We see d6, e5, d4. A lot of people play d4 immediately, but this move order can also work. e5, d4, and if you play e4 you're probably going to lose that pawn. I don't think you can really defend it here, and if you go e takes d4, I think that releasing the tension sort of helps White. So his opponent kept the tension, knight bd7, e4, gain space in the center is the sort of typical approach. c6, rook to e1, rook to e8, h3, a very typical move from White, basically trying to prepare bishop e3 maybe while stopping any knight g4 ideas. See a5 from Black, this is another very typical idea, just gaining space on the queen side, maybe even trying to go for a4 at some point. So Ulf basically just says like, no, you're not getting that, I'm just gonna stop you from doing that real quick. E takes d4 takes, knight to c5, and yeah, releasing the tension here, it often is going to happen at some point just because like Black is going to get like tired of waiting, they're going to run out of useful moves, and it can sort of help them sometimes to just define the structure that they're getting. Sometimes as well, if they wait too long, like d5 can be strong. I've seen some players like against me, they've done weird stuff like knight f8 and try to go knight e6, but in this position, for example, once they've like spent whole tempo going away like this, sometimes then you can go d5, stopping them from doing this, and then they have to spend like more time coming backwards, and it's like a big time drain, right? So e takes d4 takes, knight to c5, bishop to f4. I don't really bring the bishop to e3 here because there's a lot of pressure on this already, so we're gonna kind of drop a pawn, bishop to f4, and in this position we see Black play knight to h5, kicking the bishop away, and then queen to e7. It's worth noting that if you go queen to e7 immediately, there's a bit of an issue, and I suggest pausing the video, trying to figure out what that is. But if you've given it a bit of a think, you might have two different ideas you've come up with. One is potentially to go knight takes, c6 takes, and takes, forking these two pieces. However, it's worth noting after takes it can be difficult to visualize, but the queen has the a7 square opened up for it, and it's sort of defending the knight. And the computer actually says White's still better after e5, and I guess attacking this and opening the bishop up. But from a human perspective, I would probably kind of stop looking at this after queen a7, to be honest. Instead, what is a bit of a more probably stronger and natural move is knight d to b5. Since now you're attacking this, and after takes, you're not playing it as a sacrifice, you're just winning material straight up after like takes. So also I should note, after takes, e5 is a very important move to have when if the knight moves somewhere, it's going to be like bishop d5 or something like that, and it's just, yeah, not a very fun position to have. So knight h5, bishop to e3, then queen e7. Now with the bishop not on this diagonal, you don't have any more of these cheeky tactics, but queen d2, bishop d7. And this sort of position is where I'd like to take a bit of a stop. So generally speaking, I would say White has a bit of an advantage in general in these sorts of positions just because we have more space, and especially when Black doesn't have any clearly defined counterplay like with a4 or like d5 or f5. If we have kind of all of those under control, it can be a very miserable existence for Black, who really struggles to find any sort of queer counterplay. Well, meanwhile, we're just going to slowly like play some like king h2, f4, g4, and basically just expand our presence across the whole board. Sometimes we can even go a3, b4, and not just playing the king side and center, but also on the queen side. So we could go something like g4 here, or like king h2, any of those moves I was just mentioning. The bishop h6 is played in this game with the idea to kind of just weaken their king side a little bit by exchanging the bishops. And black implied in the game exchanging. If you actually try to avoid it with bishop to h8, there's a bit of an issue here, which is that after g4, knight to f6, you might want to try and pause the video and see what move white plays now. But the key is that with the bishop on h6 cutting the king off, you can play knight to f5, and after g takes, queen to g5, check. This is simply going to be forced mate, and after takes, this is also not too pretty. For example, queen c7, you can play g5, and then f6, you shot the bishop in. And this reminds me a lot of the last game we looked at with the bishop on a8, which really couldn't do anything, right? So that's why he took in the game, brought the queen in. Ulf brought the queen back. It kind of looks cool on h6, but the reality is we don't have enough pieces to really push forward an immediate attack. So we bring it back, f4, as I said, gaining space, and knight to h5. We easily defend against that threat though, h6, and h6 does have an idea to play kind of g5 maybe and gain some counterplay on the dark squares, so knight to f3 is played to handle that. Bishop to c8, and yeah, basically just defending the d6 square, come to queen e3, and at this point, yeah, there's a bit of a threat you might have to watch out for, e5, and if you overtake, then you drop the c5 knight. So black played knight d7 in the game, thinking that this would prevent e5. However, they probably had to go about it in a slightly different way. I think the engine wanted to really go queen to g7 so the queen wouldn't get hit with tempo, because after knight d7, the unfortunate reality is that you still allow e5, and after takes, you don't really have enough attackers on this. So queen to h8 was played, basically because like if you go this way, then you hang h6, so either you have to go here or here. He chose h8, but of course that's like a pretty miserable place to put the queen. And like again, this is just one of those positions that Ulf got time and time again, right? Like his pieces just completely dominate his opponents. He hasn't really done anything special to reach this position. He just played like pretty normal moves, and it's really just a matter at this point of like how does he again continue increasing the pressure on his opponent's position. In this game, the way he did that was very unique. Queen to a7, bit of an unexpected move, bringing the queen all the way to this side of the board, just going after this pawn over here, but it's very difficult to defend. Actually, maybe the only way is playing like pawn to b6. And actually, funnily enough, now that I think about it, maybe his idea was to go queen c7 here and continue increasing the pressure in this fashion, poaching away this guy. And if c5, maybe you have like knight b5 or knight e4, and again, black is basically paralyzed, they can't move. So rook e7 was actually played, but then knight to e4 came. I assume the idea was if takes, you could probably go rook e8 and maybe like somehow win e5 or something. But after knight e4, rook to e8, knight d6, that doesn't really work. So he went to f8 instead before he tries to take on e5, because of course if you do that immediately, then that's hanging. So rook to f8, and we take it. Now he takes, and I'm pretty sure black saw that this actually lost material. If you want to try and figure out exactly how it does, I suggest you pause the video real quick. But if you don't take, the problem is your pieces don't do anything. So it's a tough decision, but he probably is just like, oh, I can't be screwed doing this anymore. So he took, and after takes, the problem is after takes, if you calculate it correctly, you would have saw knight to f6 check takes, just simply wins the exchange. And if you take the rook first, you also do this, and you still get the same sort of situation. So yeah, at this point, exchange up, basically no real counterplay in sight. Ulf, being the very strong technical player he was, did not fail to convert this. We won't talk too much about this, but we see he does some fancy stuff here, right, with his little magic. And after b5 happens, you can't take because this is going to hang. Tries coming over here, but then like getting the passed pawn is just like you're not going to stop that. So with that, black resigned, and a good demonstration of how you know, Ulf, he really excelled not only in those sort of more classical sort of positions, but even these hyper-modern ones where he's given a space advantage. And there are a few different setups black can play in the sort of King's Indian, right? They don't have to strictly go for the knight on d7, they can sometimes play knight on c6 as well. But knight bd7 is very popular because it tends to lead to a very kind of system-like approach. The problem is, as we saw in this game, it can be a little bit passive, especially with these structures where black has taken on d4, where white has a very nice stable space advantage in the center. So for our final game of today's video, we are going to be covering Ulf playing against the Grunfeld actually, which if you've been watching my channel for a while, you'll know in my Catalan videos I haven't really been able to discuss it so far, so this is going to be a nice way to sort of introduce it. And the Grunfeld, of course, is typically against d4, the opening that arises after the following moves, right? When after takes, a very common continuation is this, and we get this sort of famous exchange Grunfeld structure. But in the Catalan, we're aiming for something a little bit different. So see the following moves, d4, and it's also possible to say go takes, and then d4. And as a d4 player, or like say you enter the Catalan starting with one d4 as opposed to one knight f3, this can very commonly occur. Let's say like you like to play the Catalan in the following fashion. d5 happens here, take. You don't really want to go e4 so quickly. You usually want to go knight f3 first. Take. This is a very common way of sort of settling into these positions. It's also possible to also play knight f3 though and just keep the tension sort of like this. And this would transpose actually what happened in the Ulf Andersson game. But okay, let's return back to the game then. So after d5, d4, we saw d takes c4 happen, just sort of taking the pawn. It's a very principled approach, just grabbing the pawn, of course, but it's also very popular to play c6, just reinforcing the pawn on d5. Also c5 is an option. This is very typical for the Grunfeld, but actually funnily enough, because basically if you think about it, black is just like basically copying us. I think after d takes c5 they are a little bit worse. It kind of makes sense if you're just going to copy all of your opponent's move, that if you're a tempo down, it's gonna fail eventually. So yeah, we saw d takes c4 though, and the way that white usually plays is knight to a3, trying to recoup the pawn like this. So knight c6, knight takes c4, and I think actually the best move is to go c3 to try and like then later on play c5 and create a bit of meat, I guess, to you could think about it that way, to sort of latch onto. Because like if you play c5 like this, right, then the problem is very often white just plays d takes c5. Whereas in these sorts of positions, if you have a pawn here, then after d takes e5, you sort of have to worry about these doubled pawns becoming weaknesses. Whereas if the pawn's on b2, that's not really as big of a worry, and you just sort of get a symmetrical structure where your pieces are more active. Hopefully that makes sense. But that's why, yeah, like in this sort of position, usually white's going to go for something a bit more solid, maybe like e3, for example, maybe put the rook on the b file, as opposed to taking on c5. But okay, we see knight to a3, knight c6 instead, knight takes e4, and black plays this line with bishop to e6. And the idea basically is to gain a tempo on the knight, of course, so Ulf protects it, and then after that bring the bishop to d5, which is a common theme in many lines of the Catalan, just basically trying to oppose the bishop on this diagonal. We continue developing though, a5, rook to c1, and basically the whole idea behind a5 is that at some point you probably want to play a4 and gain some counterplay down the c-line, because if you think about it, with the way black has sort of positioned their pieces, they don't have their typical c5 break because the knight's blocking the pawn. They also don't have e5. That's basically just way too well covered by all of white's pieces. That wasn't the most elegant way to put it, but if you can achieve a4, at least you have one avenue of counterplay. So the best move here is to go a4, and then if you take and sort of get the open a file, that's good. And if takes, then the usual plan is to go rook to a6, queen to a8, and then take the a4 pawn. But strangely enough, black actually did not play this in the game, and you can see they're about 2170 rated. I think they're like an international master now, but when they were a bit younger, they played this move rook to e8. And I want you guys to think now, because they haven't gone a4 immediately, they played this kind of slow move rook to e8, which doesn't even help them get an e5. What would you do here with all these things considered? And the correct idea now is that basically we can play pawn to a3. And now if they play a4, we can play b4, leave this pawn just stuck here, And because we have the pawn protecting this, we are able to go for this. Of course, if they play a4 immediately, b4 is not really possible. And if we play a3 before playing rook c1, then we can't go b4 here either, because then the knight would hang. So pretty much the way we have to deal with this is just take it, maybe try to like cling on to the pawn or something, or at the very least make it so in the process of them gaining the pawn, they have to make a bunch of concessions in terms of the time they invest and all that sort of fun stuff, right? So they basically didn't do any of that in the game. They made our life very easy. e3, and now we just sort of put our pieces on useful squares, probably bring this rook to d1, and then eventually maybe try and like get into the e4 break somehow. Makes enough sense. Okay, we see bishop to e4 though, and gains a tempo, and then decides that, okay, long term, the bishop's probably not going to be able to stay there if our white plays knight c to d2, and let's say you don't want to give up the bishop here. Well, you can't really go back because you get trapped, and that leaves basically your only option being this diagonal. But this also has some problems of its own, and I suggest you try to pause the video actually and figuring out what one of those problems might be, because the next move played by Ulf was a very spectacular one, you could say. Maybe that gives a bit of a hint, but okay, I'd suggest you try and think a little bit about how you would handle this for white. But basically the correct approach from here is to, well, maybe not correct, there's a few different moves, but the best one was actually to take on c6, and that's what Ulf did, sacrificing in exchange. But compared to a lot of exchanges you might sort of think of, right, this is not like some flashy exchange where you're going to be like mating them in the next 5 moves or ripping the opponent's king's head off, right? It's very much just a positional sacrifice actually, where you're getting your knight to e5, you're getting the bishop on the diagonal. Of course, knight e5 before then would run into something like take and bishop d3, right? So not as convincing, but here, with no knight kind of being the guard to the e5 square, or maybe gatekeeper is a funny word to use, then you can very comfortably get this in. And especially after knight d5, right, look at their pawn structure, it's atrocious. They have 2 sets of doubled pawns, an isolated e1, we have the bishop here, and believe it or not, this position is actually evaluated about +2. And I guess one factor in this as well is that because all these pawn weaknesses exist, and we sort of have the right minor pieces to kind of target those, and they don't really have, at least at this very moment, their rooks on sort of maybe like an open file, like the b1, to really work together in harmony, white does have an advantage. But we really need to make sure to lock in and make use of it before our advantage might evaporate. Okay, we see the following moves. We attack the g6 pawn with our bishop and sort of prepare to eventually double up on the c file and increase the pressure in that fashion as well. Worth noting that here in this position, if you take on b3, this doesn't really work, because after bishop takes g6 check, unfortunately, if you take back, this queen c2 forking this and this, and if you go back, well, we also win back the exchange, so black avoided that in favor of knight to e7. Now preparing to actually take, because if you take then, this knight takes g6, so queen c2, rook b6, bishop c3, and after rook a8 defending it, rook c5, rook a b8, black actually came back the other way. White was on the cusp of really creating something like really good with bishop takes a5, and then after rook takes b3, then coming back with the bishop and basically trapping the rook, winning material and having an excellent life. But instead, Ulf ended up spoiling a lot of his advantage by playing knight to d2, which is characteristic of him trying to prevent as much of his opponent's counterplay as he possibly could. But in this situation was just unfortunately a little bit slow. We saw rook to b5, and he probably didn't want to allow the exchange of rooks here by taking, although still I think this would have been his best option. Instead he came back, allowed his opponent to keep the a5 pawn and also get some counterplay of e5 in. We can see actually a very clever sacrifice from the opponent, saying that okay, you can take this, but after takes, like, everything's opening up and you've sort of lost a lot of the control you once had. So he tried to do this, and to be honest, this part of the game I think his opponent probably handled quite decently. And it's also worth noting that Ulf in this game was not in his prime. You can see his rating has dropped down below 2600. At his peak he was like 2670 I think, which at the time he was 2670, probably a bit more like 2750 by today's standards. But yeah, we see basically in this position his advantage wasn't as compelling, and from a middle game perspective there's not as much to kind of learn from here. This is more I should say like early middle game perspective where the opening is more relevant. From here, this was sort of more of a messy battle that wasn't actually very typical for Ulf's games, that he kind of lost control like this. I also wouldn't be surprised if at this point they were kind of in time trouble as well, which would affect some of these moves. But eventually he managed to come out on top in this sort of scramble, and yeah, his opponent never really managed to find a kind of clear, compelling role for the rook. Because of that, white indeed actually was better here. If you count the pawns, you'll see we have 5 for 3, but given that their king is also quite weak, that definitely plays into kind of why white has an advantage here. Ce4, we finally take that, and now we can really see a more tangible material advantage for white. And okay, the game is going to conclude fairly soon. The pawns are rolling down the board, and now he just cannot simply stop the pawn from promoting. But with that being said, that's going to be all for tonight's video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Hope you found it useful. If you want more help with your game one-on-one, maybe you also want to like learn more in depth some stuff on the Catalan opening, feel free to apply. I have a link down below for private one-on-one coaching. But that being said, I have nothing more to say for tonight. Hope you guys have a good one.